I was 23 when my cousin Victoria called me a disappointment at Grandpa Bill's 85th birthday party. She didn't whisper it behind closed doors like the others did. She said it right there in the marble foyer of the Morgan estate, her champagne flute catching the light from the crystal chandelier, her voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that only comes with inherited confidence. "You don't belong here, Alex," she said, adjusting her pearl necklace the way people adjust masks. "You never have. Grandpa's just too polite to say it." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Morgan family mansion in Millbrook, Connecticut, had always felt like a museum to me, all polished mahogany and oil paintings of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you with judgment. I grew up in the groundskeeper's cottage with my mother, who cleaned the main house and tended to Grandpa Bill's correspondence. My father had been the estate's head gardener until his death when I was 12, killed by a drunk driver on his way home from picking up supplies in town. The family had been generous then, or so I was told. They let us stay in the cottage, gave my mother steady work, and even helped with my father's funeral expenses. But generosity, I learned, always comes with invisible strings attached. Victoria was everything I wasn't. Blonde where I was dark-haired, confident where I was quiet, born into wealth where I had been born into service. Her father, Robert Morgan, was Grandpa Bill's eldest son, and the presumed heir to Morgan Industries, the real estate development company that had built half of Connecticut's luxury communities over the past 40 years. Victoria had graduated from Yale with a business degree she'd never had to use, married a hedge fund manager named Jonathan Hayes, and spent her days planning charity galas and managing what she called her personal brand. She lived in a penthouse in Manhattan, drove a car that cost more than most people's houses, and treated family gatherings like performances where she was always the star. I, on the other hand, had worked my way through state college with a combination of academic scholarships, part-time jobs, and student loans that would follow me for decades. I studied environmental engineering, not because it was prestigious, but because I believed in it. I believed that technology could solve problems, that innovation mattered more than inheritance, that the future belonged to people who built things rather than people who simply owned them. But at family gatherings, I was still just the groundskeeper's kid, the charity case who happened to share the Morgan name through my father's bloodline. Grandpa Bill was different from the rest of them, though. While Robert would barely acknowledge my presence and Patricia would smile that tight, uncomfortable smile whenever I spoke, Grandpa Bill actually listened. He'd find me reading in the estate's library during family visits and sit beside me, asking about my studies, my ideas, my plans. He was the one who encouraged me to apply for engineering programs, who slipped me books about renewable energy and sustainable development, who seemed to understand that I saw the world differently than the rest of his family did. The night of his birthday party, after Victoria's public humiliation in the foyer, I found myself alone on the estate's back terrace, looking out over the gardens my father had once maintained. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from the massive fireplace inside. I could hear laughter and conversation drifting through the French doors, the sound of a family celebrating without me. That was when Grandpa Bill found me, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing that gentle smile that had always made me feel like maybe I did belong somewhere. "You know," he said, settling into the wrought iron chair beside me, "your father used to sit out here when your grandmother's dinner parties got too stuffy for him. He said the gardens were more honest than the house." I looked at him, surprised. I'd never heard him talk about my father that way, as someone he'd actually known and respected rather than just employed. Grandpa Bill sipped his coffee and continued. "He had big dreams, your dad. Wanted to study landscape architecture, design public parks, create green spaces in cities. But life got in the way, as it often does. He met your mother, you came along, and he decided his family mattered more than his ambitions." I felt something twist in my chest, a mix of pride and sadness I wasn't prepared for. I'd never known my father had dreams beyond the estate grounds. "Why are you telling me this, Grandpa Bill?" I asked. "Because," he said, looking directly at me with those sharp blue eyes that age hadn't dimmed, "I see him in you. That same hunger to build something meaningful, that same refusal to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be. Don't let anyone convince you that your dreams are too small or too big, Alex. They're exactly the right size for you." The conversation stayed with me through the weeks that followed, even as I returned to my cramped apartment in Portland, Oregon, where I was working as a junior engineer for a small renewable energy consulting firm. The apartment was nothing like the Morgan estate, just a studio above a coffee shop with thin walls and a radiator that clanged through the night, but it was mine, paid for with my own money, furnished with second-hand finds and determination. I'd moved to Portland right after college graduation, drawn by the city's commitment to sustainability and its thriving community of environmental innovators. The Pacific Northwest felt like home in ways Connecticut never had. My job at Green Tech Solutions was entry-level and underpaid, but it gave me access to real projects and real problems that needed solving. I spent my days analyzing energy efficiency data for small businesses and municipal buildings, learning how power grids worked, studying the economics of solar installation and wind generation. My evenings were consumed by side projects, coding energy management software on my laptop, sketching out designs for more efficient battery storage systems, researching patents and market gaps in the clean energy sector. I wasn't making much money, but I was learning everything. The Portland tech scene was different from the stuffy boardrooms I'd glimpsed during family visits to Robert's offices in Manhattan. Here, innovation came from coffee shops and shared workspaces, from 20-somethings working 18-hour days because they believed they could change the world. I started attending meetups and networking events, not because I was naturally social, but because I realized that good ideas needed advocates, and advocacy required connections. I was still the quiet one in most rooms, still more comfortable with spreadsheets than small talk, but I began to understand that success in the modern world required more than just technical knowledge. It was at one of these meetups that I met Marcus Thompson, a software developer from Seattle, who'd moved to Portland to work for a startup focused on smart grid technology. Marcus was everything I wasn't: outgoing and charismatic, the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately become the center of conversation. But he was also genuinely curious about other people's ideas, and when I mentioned my work on energy management algorithms during a break between presentations, he leaned in with real interest. "Tell me more about that," he said, and for the next hour we talked about load balancing and demand forecasting like other people discussed sports. Marcus became my first real friend in Portland, and eventually my business partner, though neither of us knew it at the time. He'd studied computer science at University of Washington and had been working in tech for 5 years, bouncing between companies that promised to change the world, but mostly just moved advertising dollars around more efficiently. He was looking for something that mattered, he told me over drinks after that first meetup, something that would let him use his skills to solve actual problems instead of optimizing click-through rates. When I showed him the prototype energy management system I'd been building in my spare time, his eyes lit up with the kind of recognition that told me I'd found the right person. The system was crude but functional.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
A collection of sensors and software that could monitor a building's energy usage in real time and automatically adjust lighting, heating and cooling to minimize waste without sacrificing comfort. I'd tested it in my apartment building with permission from my landlord, and over 3 months we'd reduced energy consumption by 30% while actually improving the living conditions for tenants. The savings were significant enough that the landlord had offered to pay for the equipment if I'd install it building-wide. That was when I realized I might have stumbled onto something bigger than a side project. Marcus had the business experience I lacked, and the social skills to turn technical concepts into compelling presentations. Within 6 months of our first meeting, we were spending every evening and weekend working on what we'd started calling EcoFlow systems, developing the software, refining the hardware specifications, and researching the market for intelligent building management solutions. We worked out of Marcus's apartment, which was slightly larger than mine, and had better internet, surrounded by whiteboards covered in diagrams and empty coffee cups that multiplied faster than we could wash them. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered a government grant program designed to support clean energy startups, developing commercially viable solutions to climate change. The application process was intensive, requiring detailed technical documentation, market analysis, and financial projections that stretched our understanding of business planning to its limits. But it also represented the possibility of real funding, enough money to quit our day jobs and focus on EcoFlow full-time. I spent weeks perfecting our technical specifications, while Marcus crafted a business plan that transformed our collection of sensors and code into a coherent vision for the future of smart buildings. We submitted the application on a Thursday in February, exactly 18 months after that first meetup, where we'd started talking about energy management algorithms. I remember hitting send on the email and immediately feeling terrified that we'd forgotten something important, some crucial piece of documentation that would disqualify us from consideration. Marcus ordered pizza, and we spent the evening playing video games and trying not to think about the fact that our entire future now depended on the judgment of bureaucrats we'd never met reviewing a proposal they might not even understand. The response came 3 months later, on a Tuesday morning when Portland was experiencing one of those rare days of sunshine that makes the entire city seem more optimistic. Marcus called me at work, his voice unsteady with excitement. "Alex," he said, "we got it. The grant, $250,000. I had to ask him to repeat the number, because it seemed impossible, more money than I'd ever imagined having access to, enough to turn our after-hours obsession into an actual company." I took the rest of the day off, not because my boss was understanding, but because I couldn't focus on anything except the realization that everything was about to change. The first year of running EcoFlow systems was chaos in the best possible way. We rented a small office space in southeast Portland, in one of those converted warehouse buildings that housed dozens of startups with names like Optimistic Abstractions. Our neighbors included a company developing drone delivery systems, a team building virtual reality therapy applications, and a group that claimed to be revolutionizing urban farming through artificial intelligence, though none of us were entirely sure what that meant. The building hummed with the energy of people convinced they were about to change the world, and for the first time since leaving Connecticut, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Marcus and I hired our first employees, a brilliant electrical engineer named David Kim, who could design hardware that actually worked, and a marketing specialist named Jennifer Walsh, who understood how to explain complicated technical concepts to people who just wanted their buildings to use less energy and save money. We were still operating on startup budgets, eating ramen, and working 16-hour days, but we were building something real, something that solved actual problems for actual people. Our first major client was a small office building in downtown Portland, whose owner had heard about our system through a mutual connection and was desperate to reduce operating costs. The installation took 2 weeks and required us to debug problems we'd never anticipated, but when we switched the system on, the results were immediate and measurable. Energy consumption dropped by 28% in the first month, saving the building owner more money than he'd paid for our entire system. Word spread quickly through Portland's tight-knit community of environmentally conscious business owners, and suddenly we had a waiting list of potential clients. The success felt surreal, like playing a video game where the difficulty level had been accidentally set too low. Every problem we solved led to 2 new opportunities. Every satisfied client recommended us to 3 more potential customers. The local business journal wrote an article about EcoFlow systems as an example of homegrown innovation making a real impact on the city's sustainability goals. Marcus framed the article and hung it in our office, next to a whiteboard where we tracked our growing list of installations and projected revenue. But even as the company grew and success became undeniable, I found myself thinking about Grandpa Bill's words on that October evening, about my father's abandoned dreams and the importance of building something meaningful. The Morgan family felt like a distant memory, a previous life that belonged to someone else. I hadn't spoken to any of them since that birthday party, hadn't received any calls or emails asking about my life in Portland. It was as if I'd simply ceased to exist once I'd left Connecticut, which was exactly what I'd wanted, but somehow still stung in moments of quiet reflection. The call came on a Wednesday morning in November, almost 3 years after I'd left Millbrook. I was in the office early, reviewing specifications for a potential installation at a university campus, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but a Connecticut area code that made my stomach tighten. Elena Rodriguez, the voice said when I answered, from Whitmore and Associates in Hartford. I represent your grandfather's estate. I need to speak with you about William Morgan's will. The words didn't make sense at first, like someone speaking a foreign language I almost but didn't quite understand. Grandpa Bill's will, I repeated, still staring at the technical drawings spread across my desk. Is he? I couldn't finish the question. Mr. Rodriguez's voice was gentle but professional. I'm sorry to inform you that your grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 nights ago. The funeral was yesterday, a small service as he requested, but Alex, there's something you need to know. You're named in his will, and the reading is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Can you be in Connecticut by 2 o'clock? I stared out the window at the Portland skyline, at the life I'd built 3,000 miles away from the Morgan estate, and felt the ground shift beneath me in ways I wasn't prepared to understand. Of course, I heard myself saying, I'll be there. Part 2. The flight from Portland to Hartford felt endless, 6 hours suspended between the life I'd built and the family I'd left behind. I sat in an economy seat that felt too small, staring out at clouds that looked like cotton stretched thin, trying to process the reality that Grandpa Bill was gone. The last time I'd spoken to him was 8 months ago, a brief phone call where he'd asked about my work and told me he was proud of what I was accomplishing. His voice had sounded tired then, older somehow, but I'd attributed it to the late hour rather than anything more serious. Now I wondered what I'd missed, what signs I'd ignored because I was too focused on building my future to pay attention to his present. The rental car at Bradley International Airport was a compact sedan that smelled like industrial air freshener and previous renters' regrets. I drove through Connecticut's autumn landscape on autopilot, past towns that looked exactly as I remembered them, unchanged by the years that had transformed me completely. The leaves were brilliant orange and red, the kind of New England fall that postcards were made to capture, but I barely noticed the beauty. My mind was racing through possibilities, trying to understand why Elena Rodriguez had sounded so urgent on the phone, why she'd insisted I needed to be at the will reading rather than simply mailing me whatever small remembrance Grandpa Bill had left behind. The Morgan estate looked smaller than it had in my memories, though still impressive enough to remind any visitor that serious money had lived here for generations. The circular driveway was freshly raked, the hedges perfectly trimmed, the brass fixtures polished to mirror brightness. A black sedan and a silver Mercedes were already parked near the front entrance, and I recognized them as belonging to Robert and Patricia. My hands trembled slightly as I locked the rental car, smoothed my best suit jacket, and walked toward the massive oak doors that had intimidated me since childhood. Elena Rodriguez met me in the foyer, and I was surprised to discover she was younger than her voice had suggested, probably in her early 40s, with steel gray hair pulled into a professional bun, and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. She wore a charcoal suit that managed to look both expensive and understated, and when she shook my hand, her grip was firm and warm. Alex, she said, thank you for coming so quickly. I know this must be difficult for you. Before we begin, I want you to know that your grandfather spoke of you often in recent months. He was very proud of what you've accomplished in Portland. She led me through familiar hallways, lined with portraits of Morgan ancestors, past the library where Grandpa Bill and I had shared so many conversations, toward the formal dining room that had been converted into a temporary meeting space for the will reading. The heavy mahogany table was surrounded by chairs, and I could hear voices coming from within, the kind of hushed, serious conversation that accompanies legal proceedings and family obligations. Elena paused outside the door and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Alex," she said quietly, "I want you to be prepared. This afternoon might be more significant than you're expecting." The dining room fell silent when I entered, 5 pairs of eyes turning toward me with varying degrees of surprise, curiosity, and barely concealed hostility. Robert sat at the head of the table, looking exactly as I remembered him, tall and imposing with silver hair that had been professionally styled to suggest both authority and approachability. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than I'd made in my first month at Green Tech Solutions, and his expression carried the same mixture of tolerance and dismissal I'd grown accustomed to during family gatherings. Patricia sat to his right, her blonde hair arranged in the kind of elaborate style that required professional maintenance, her jewelry carefully chosen to suggest wealth without ostentation. Victoria was there too, of course positioned directly across from the empty chair that Elena gestured for me to take. She looked older than I remembered, lines around her eyes that suggested stress or unhappiness, but her posture remained perfectly straight, her clothing impeccably chosen to project success and confidence. Jonathan, her hedge fund manager husband, sat beside her checking his phone with the kind of casual disregard for the proceedings that suggested he considered this a minor inconvenience in his important schedule. The fifth person in the room was someone I didn't recognize, an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered face who nodded politely when I sat down. Elena took her place at the opposite end of the table from Robert and opened a leather portfolio that contained what I assumed was Grandpa Bill's will. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying the formal tone that legal proceedings require, "we're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of William Morgan, dated March 15th of this year and properly witnessed according to Connecticut state law. Before we begin with the specific bequests, I should mention that Mr. Morgan was very clear about his wishes regarding the distribution of his estate and the reasoning behind his decisions." Robert leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the table in the posture of a man accustomed to being in charge of important meetings. "Elena," he said, "I think we all understand that this is primarily a formality. The family business and estate have been planned for years, and while we certainly want to honor Dad's wishes regarding personal items and charitable bequests, the major decisions have already been made through proper estate planning channels." His tone carried the confidence of someone who'd never had reason to doubt that the world would arrange itself according to his expectations. Elena's expression remained perfectly neutral, but I caught something in her eyes that might have been amusement. "Mr. Morgan," she replied, "I think you'll find that your father's will contains some provisions that weren't discussed in previous estate planning meetings. He was quite specific about wanting certain decisions to remain private until this moment. If you're ready, I'll begin with the reading." She cleared her throat and lifted the first page of the document, and something in the room's atmosphere shifted, became more tense and expectant. The will began with standard legal language about sound mind and revoked previous wills, but Elena's voice carried weight as she read through the opening paragraphs. Then came the first surprise. "To my son Robert Morgan, who has faithfully managed Morgan Industries for the past 15 years, I leave my collection of first edition books, my grandfather's hunting rifles, and the sum of $500,000, to be distributed immediately upon my death. Additionally, Robert will receive the Connecticut Avenue property in Hartford and the summer cottage in Cape Cod, both free and clear of any mortgages or liens." Robert's face showed no emotion, but I could see his jaw tighten slightly. $500,000 was significant money to most people, but for someone who'd expected to inherit a multi-million-dollar company and the family estate, it represented something closer to a slap in the face. Patricia reached over and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that might have been comfort or restraint. Victoria's eyes had gone wide, and she was staring at Elena with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was beginning to realize this afternoon might not unfold according to her assumptions. Elena continued reading, "To my daughter Patricia Morgan Klein, who has always brought joy to family gatherings and maintained connections with our extended relatives, I leave my late wife's jewelry collection, including her engagement ring and the pearl necklace that belonged to her grandmother. Additionally, Patricia will receive the sum of $300,000 and the condominium in Naples, Florida, which she and her family have enjoyed during winter vacations." Victoria shifted in her chair, and I could practically see her calculating how much money had been distributed so far and how much might remain for the primary inheritance. Jonathan looked up from his phone for the first time since I'd entered the room, his expression suggesting he was beginning to pay attention to proceedings he'd previously considered beneath his notice. To Victoria Morgan Hayes, Elena read, who has worked to establish herself in New York society, and who has always understood the importance of the Morgan family name, I leave the sum of $200,000, my late wife's china collection, and the vintage Jaguar that she admired during family visits. Additionally, Victoria will receive the family's collection of antique furniture, which I trust she will appreciate and maintain for future generations. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's face had gone pale, and her carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack around the edges. $200,000 was a substantial sum to most people, but it was far less than she'd clearly expected to receive from the estate of one of Connecticut's wealthiest families. Jonathan had put his phone down entirely and was staring at Elena with the kind of sharp attention that hedge fund managers reserved for market-moving information. Robert's face had darkened, and I could see him struggling to maintain the dignified demeanor that family patriarchs were expected to display during formal proceedings. The elderly man I didn't recognize had been watching the proceedings with evident interest, occasionally making notes on a small pad he'd pulled from his jacket pocket. When Elena paused and looked around the table, he leaned forward slightly. "Rodriguez," he said in a gravelly voice that suggested years of cigarettes and whiskey, "I believe we're all wondering about the disposition of the primary estate and the family business." His tone was respectful but pointed, the voice of someone accustomed to cutting through formalities to reach essential information. Elena nodded and turned to a new page of the will. "Indeed, Mr. Patterson, William Morgan was very specific about his wishes regarding Morgan Industries and the family estate." She looked directly at me for a moment, and I felt my stomach tighten with anxiety I couldn't name. "To my grandson Alex Morgan," she read, "who has demonstrated integrity, innovation, and commitment to building something meaningful rather than simply inheriting something valuable, I leave the remainder of my estate." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence that followed, as if the room itself was struggling to process what had just been said. I stared at Elena, certain I'd misheard something essential, waiting for her to clarify that there had been some mistake in the legal language. But she continued reading, her voice steady and clear. "This includes Morgan Industries and all associated assets, the family estate in Millbrook including all buildings and grounds, investment portfolios valued at approximately $12 million, and various additional properties and holdings detailed in the attached schedules." Victoria made a sound that might have been a gasp or a sob, and Jonathan was staring at me with the kind of naked calculation that suggested he was rapidly reassessing my importance in ways that made me deeply uncomfortable. Robert had gone completely still, his face a mask of controlled fury that reminded me uncomfortably of my childhood memories of his rare but explosive temper. Patricia was looking back and forth between me and Elena, as if trying to understand a conversation being conducted in a foreign language, but Elena wasn't finished reading. Furthermore, Elena continued, "Alex Morgan is appointed as the sole executor of this estate and is granted complete authority over all business and property decisions without requirement for family consultation or approval. However, these bequests come with specific conditions and responsibilities that Alex must accept within 30 days of this reading, or the estate will be donated in its entirety to the Environmental Defense Fund and the Connecticut Land Trust." The room erupted into chaos. Robert stood so quickly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor, his face flushed with anger and disbelief. "This is impossible," he said, his voice louder than the dignified tone he'd maintained throughout the reading. "Dad wouldn't have done this without discussing it with me. There has to be some mistake, some legal error. I've been running Morgan Industries for 15 years. I've devoted my entire career to building that company." Victoria was crying now, quiet tears that she was trying to hide behind her hands, and Jonathan was typing furiously on his phone, probably researching will contest procedures or calculating how much money had just slipped through their fingers. Elena's voice cut through the commotion with professional authority. "Mr. Morgan," she said, addressing Robert, "your father was absolutely clear about his intentions. He met with me monthly for the past 8 months to ensure that this will was properly drafted and legally sound. He also prepared a detailed letter explaining his reasoning, which he requested I read only if there were questions about his mental state or decision-making capacity." She pulled a sealed envelope from her portfolio and held it up for everyone to see. "Would you like me to read his explanation now, or would you prefer to process the terms of the will first?" I found my voice for the first time since Elena had begun reading. "Wait," I said, and everyone turned to stare at me. "I need to understand what this means. What are these conditions you mentioned? What responsibilities?" I had visions of being tied to Connecticut forever, of having to abandon EcoFlow systems and Marcus and everything I'd built in Portland to manage a business I knew nothing about and didn't particularly want. The inheritance felt less like a gift than a trap, and I needed to understand what accepting it would cost me. Elena smiled for the first time since I'd arrived, an expression that seemed genuinely warm rather than professionally polite. "That's exactly the kind of question your grandfather hoped you would ask, Alex. The conditions are quite reasonable and actually align with work you're already doing." She turned to a different section of the will and began reading again. "First, Alex must complete his current business obligations in Portland and arrange for responsible transition of his company to his business partner or other qualified management. Second, Alex must commit to operating Morgan Industries according to sustainable business practices and environmental responsibility standards to be defined in consultation with recognized environmental organizations." The requirements continued, and I found myself leaning forward despite my confusion and anxiety. Third, Alex must establish a scholarship program for students from working-class families pursuing degrees in environmental science, engineering, or related fields, with initial funding of $2 million from the estate. Fourth, Alex must maintain the family estate as his primary residence for a minimum of 5 years, during which time he may make any modifications or improvements he deems necessary. Fifth, Alex must honor existing employment contracts for all Morgan Industries employees while implementing whatever business changes he believes will improve the company's long-term sustainability and profitability. The final condition surprised me most of all. Sixth, and finally, Elena read, Alex must provide reasonable financial support to family members who request assistance for legitimate needs, but he is under no obligation to provide support for lifestyle maintenance or luxury expenses. Your grandfather was quite specific about wanting family members to contribute meaningfully to their own support rather than simply living off inherited wealth. She looked around the table at the stunned faces of Robert, Patricia, and Victoria. He believed that inherited responsibility was more valuable than inherited privilege. Mr. Patterson, the elderly man whose identity I still didn't understand, cleared his throat and addressed Elena directly. Miss Rodriguez, he said, I believe the family would benefit from understanding Mr. Morgan's reasoning for these decisions. Perhaps you could read his explanatory letter now. Robert and Victoria both nodded eagerly, clearly hoping that Grandpa Bill's explanation would somehow reveal this entire reading to be an elaborate mistake or temporary mental lapse that could be corrected through proper legal channels. Elena opened the sealed envelope and removed several pages of handwritten text in Grandpa Bill's familiar script. She cleared her throat and began reading in a voice that somehow carried his cadence and gentle authority. To my family, he had written, I know this reading has come as a surprise, and I want you to understand that every decision I've made has been carefully considered over many months of reflection. I love each of you deeply, but love doesn't always mean giving people what they expect or what they think they want. The letter continued with observations that felt both loving and brutally honest. Robert, you have been a capable manager of Morgan Industries, but you have never shown interest in innovation or growth beyond traditional real estate development. You have treated the company as a source of steady income rather than an opportunity to create lasting value or positive impact. Patricia, you have always been kind and caring, but you have never shown interest in business or responsibility beyond social obligations. Victoria, you have intelligence and ambition, but you have focused those qualities on acquiring status and luxury rather than building something meaningful. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair as Elena continued reading, feeling like an intruder listening to private family observations I had no right to hear. Alex, however, has demonstrated exactly the qualities I hope to see in the next generation of Morgan leadership. He has built a successful business from nothing, using his own skills and determination. He has chosen to focus on work that makes a positive difference in the world rather than simply pursuing profit. He has shown integrity under pressure and loyalty to his principles, even when those principles cost him family acceptance. The letter went on to explain Grandpa Bill's vision for Morgan Industries under my leadership, his hopes that I would transform the company from traditional real estate development into sustainable community building that prioritized environmental responsibility and social impact. He had researched EcoFlow systems extensively, had spoken with Marcus and even some of our clients, and had concluded that I possessed both the technical knowledge and ethical foundation necessary to guide Morgan Industries into a more meaningful future. Elena finished reading and folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope. She looked around the table at the family members who were still processing the reality that their expectations for this afternoon had been completely overturned. Alex, she said, you have 30 days to decide whether to accept these conditions and responsibilities. If you decline the inheritance, everything will be donated to environmental organizations as specified in the will. If you accept, the transition of assets and business operations will begin immediately. The drive back to my hotel that evening felt surreal, like returning from a dream that had been too strange to process completely. I sat in the rental car in the parking lot for 20 minutes before going inside, calling Marcus to explain why I wouldn't be returning to Portland as scheduled. His voice sounded tiny and distant through the phone connection, and I struggled to find words that made sense of what had happened. Your grandfather left you a multi-million-dollar company, he repeated slowly, and you're not sure if you want it. Alex, I need you to hear how insane that sounds to someone who's been eating ramen noodles for dinner 3 nights a week. But it wasn't insane, not when I understood what accepting the inheritance would mean. It would mean leaving Portland and the life I'd built there. It would mean taking responsibility for a company I'd never wanted to inherit and didn't know how to run. It would mean dealing with family members who clearly resented my sudden elevation and would probably spend years trying to undermine my authority. Most importantly, it would mean abandoning EcoFlow systems at exactly the moment when we were beginning to achieve real success and expand beyond the Pacific Northwest. Part 3. The Whitmore and Associates office building in Hartford looked like every other corporate law firm, all glass and steel designed to project competence and discretion in equal measure. I arrived early for my follow-up meeting with Elena Rodriguez, carrying a folder full of questions I'd spent 3 sleepless nights preparing. The will reading had been 48 hours ago, but I still felt like I was processing information that belonged to someone else's life. The lobby smelled like expensive coffee and leather furniture, and the receptionist spoke in the kind of hushed tones that suggested important business was always being conducted just beyond the mahogany doors. Elena's office was surprisingly warm for a law firm, filled with plants and photographs that suggested she had interests beyond billable hours and estate planning. She gestured for me to sit in a comfortable chair across from her desk, rather than in the formal seating area where she probably met with clients who needed to be impressed. Alex, she said, pouring coffee from a machine that looked more sophisticated than anything in EcoFlow's office, I imagine you have questions about the inheritance and what accepting it would actually involve. I opened my folder and pulled out the list I'd been working on since leaving the estate. The first question surprised even me as I heard myself asking it. Did Grandpa Bill know about EcoFlow systems before he wrote the will? I mean, really know about it, not just that I was working in renewable energy. Elena smiled and pulled a thick file from her desk drawer. Your grandfather hired a private investigator to research your business activities beginning about 18 months ago. He has detailed reports on your company's growth, financial performance, client satisfaction, and market potential. He also has letters of recommendation from several of your clients and a technical analysis of your energy management system prepared by an independent engineering consultant. The revelation that Grandpa Bill had been investigating my life felt both touching and slightly invasive. He knew about our grant funding, Elena continued, your partnership with Marcus, your expansion plans, even your projected revenue for the next 3 years. He was particularly impressed by your decision to reinvest profits into research and development rather than taking larger salaries or expanding too quickly. He saw that as evidence of long-term thinking and genuine commitment to your mission rather than just personal enrichment. My second question was more practical. If I accept the inheritance, what happens to Morgan Industries' current operations? Do I have to fire Robert, or does he stay on as an employee? Elena consulted another section of her file. Your grandfather was clear that you have complete authority over staffing decisions, but he hoped you would consider keeping Robert in a management role if he's willing to work under your leadership. Robert has institutional knowledge and client relationships that would be difficult to replace, and his departure might destabilize the company during the transition period. However, ultimate decision-making authority would rest with you as the new owner. The idea of being Robert's boss felt absurd, like a role reversal from a badly written movie. He had dismissed me as irrelevant for my entire life, and now I was supposed to manage his career and evaluate his performance. But Elena's next words suggested that Grandpa Bill had anticipated this awkwardness. Your grandfather also left detailed notes about each employee at Morgan Industries, including assessments of their capabilities, limitations, and potential for adapting to new leadership and company direction. He believed that most of the current staff would welcome changes that made the company more innovative and environmentally responsible. We spent 2 hours going through the practical details of the inheritance, from tax implications to business licenses to the logistics of relocating from Portland to Connecticut. Elena had prepared comprehensive documentation that suggested Grandpa Bill had thought through every possible complication and provided solutions for problems I hadn't even considered yet. The transition could be as gradual or immediate as I chose, she explained, but there were advantages to beginning the process quickly while the will was still being probated and before family members had time to organize legal challenges. That afternoon, I drove through downtown Hartford, looking at the city where I might soon be conducting business, trying to imagine myself as the owner of Morgan Industries, rather than the groundskeeper's son who wasn't quite family. The company's headquarters occupied 3 floors of a modern office building near the Connecticut River, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the state capitol building and the insurance company towers that dominated the skyline. I sat in the parking garage for 30 minutes watching employees leave for the day, wondering what they knew about the inheritance and whether they were speculating about their futures under new ownership. The phone call from Victoria came that evening as I was eating room service dinner in my hotel room and trying to process everything Elena had told me. Her voice sounded different than it had during the will reading, smaller somehow, less certain of her right to make demands. Alex, she said, we need to talk. Not as a family, just you and me. There are things you need to understand about the business, about Dad's expectations, about what this inheritance really means. I could hear traffic in the background and realized she was probably calling from her car, perhaps sitting in her own parking garage, having her own moment of reckoning. We agreed to meet for breakfast the next morning at a diner in Millbrook, neutral territory that didn't carry the weight of family history or legal proceedings. I arrived first and chose a booth in the back corner where we could speak privately, ordering coffee and trying to prepare myself for a conversation I'd never expected to have. Victoria looked tired when she walked in, her usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled, her confidence replaced by something that might have been vulnerability. She slid into the booth across from me and ordered coffee without looking at the menu. "Alex," she began, and then stopped, apparently struggling with words that didn't come naturally. "I owe you an apology. Not just for the other night at Grandpa's birthday party, but for years of treating you like you didn't matter, like you weren't really family." Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup like she needed something to hold on to. "I was jealous of how much attention Grandpa gave you, how much he seemed to believe in your potential, and I handled that jealousy badly. I made you feel unwelcome when I should have been proud to have a cousin who was actually building something meaningful." The apology surprised me, though I wasn't sure how much it changed anything between us. I waited for her to continue, sensing there was more she needed to say. Victoria took a shaky breath and looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. "I also need you to know that accepting this inheritance isn't going to be easy, not just because of the business responsibilities, but because Robert and Patricia are already talking to lawyers about contesting the will. They think they can prove that Grandpa was mentally incompetent when he made his final changes, or that you somehow manipulated him into changing his plans." The idea that I had manipulated Grandpa Bill was so absurd it was almost funny, except for the fact that family members apparently believed it was possible. I asked Victoria what kind of evidence they thought they could present, and her answer made me realize how serious their intentions were. "They're planning to argue that your sudden reappearance in his life during his final months was suspicious," she said. "They want to claim that you used his guilt about your father's death and your childhood circumstances to convince him to change the will in your favor. Robert has already contacted a firm that specializes in estate litigation, and they seem to think there's enough emotional manipulation angle to justify a court challenge." I sat back in the booth, feeling overwhelmed by the realization that accepting the inheritance would mean years of legal battles and family warfare. But Victoria wasn't finished with her revelations. "There's something else you need to know," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Jonathan's hedge fund has been struggling for the past 2 years, and we have significant debts that I haven't told anyone about. I was counting on inheritance money to solve our financial problems, and now I don't know what we're going to do." She looked like she was about to cry, and I found myself feeling sorry for her, despite years of antagonism between us. The conversation continued for almost 2 hours, with Victoria explaining the complex financial and emotional dynamics I would inherit along with Morgan Industries and the family estate. She told me about Robert's resentment over being passed over for leadership despite his years of service, about Patricia's disappointment that her children wouldn't inherit the wealth she'd expected to pass down, about extended family members who would have opinions about my fitness to manage the Morgan legacy. It was a sobering introduction to the politics and personalities I would have to navigate if I chose to accept Grandpa Bill's conditions. But Victoria also shared information that helped me understand why Grandpa Bill had made his decision. She admitted that Robert had been resistant to modernizing Morgan Industries, preferring traditional development projects that generated steady profits without requiring innovation or risk-taking. She acknowledged that none of the current family members had shown interest in environmental responsibility or sustainable business practices, and that the company had been gradually losing market share to competitors who offered more innovative solutions to municipal and commercial clients. By the time we parted ways in the diner parking lot, I had a much clearer picture of what accepting the inheritance would cost me and what it might accomplish. Victoria hugged me goodbye, something she'd never done before, and whispered that she hoped I would be brave enough to take on the challenge despite the difficulties it would bring. Her words stayed with me as I drove back to Hartford for another meeting with Elena Rodriguez, this time to discuss the specific steps required to begin the transition process. The phone call to Marcus that evening was one of the most difficult conversations I'd ever had. I explained the inheritance situation as clearly as I could, but I could hear the disappointment in his voice even as he tried to be supportive. "So you're leaving EcoFlow Systems," he said finally, "just when we're about to expand into California and maybe get that contract with the university system, just when everything we've worked for is starting to pay off." I tried to explain that accepting the inheritance would allow me to implement our energy management technology on a much larger scale through Morgan Industries, but Marcus was understandably focused on the immediate impact of my departure on our partnership. We talked for almost 3 hours, working through the practical details of how EcoFlow Systems could continue without me, and what kind of transition timeline would be fair to our existing clients and employees. Marcus was capable of running the company alone, especially with the management systems we'd developed over the past 2 years, but losing my technical expertise and business development efforts would undoubtedly slow our growth. We agreed that I would maintain a consulting relationship with EcoFlow for at least the first year, providing technical support and strategic guidance while Marcus took over day-to-day operations. The conversation with my mother was shorter but equally emotional. She still lived in the groundskeeper's cottage on the Morgan estate, and Elena had assured me that the inheritance included provisions for her continued residence and employment for as long as she wanted to stay. But my mother was more concerned about how the family would treat her once I became their employer rather than their dismissed relative. "They've barely spoken to me since you left Connecticut," she said, her voice heavy with years of accumulated loneliness. "How are they going to feel about working for your mother?" I promised her that accepting the inheritance would mean she would never have to worry about job security or housing again, but I could hear the skepticism in her silence. My mother had spent decades navigating the complicated dynamics of working for people who considered themselves her social superiors, and she understood better than I did how much resentment my sudden elevation would generate. She also knew that family wealth could disappear as quickly as it accumulated, and that the security I was promising might be more fragile than either of us wanted to believe. The decision crystallized for me during a long walk through downtown Hartford the next morning, past office buildings, where people were beginning their workdays, and coffee shops, where entrepreneurs were probably planning their own versions of changing the world. I realized that my hesitation about accepting the inheritance wasn't really about the money or the business responsibilities. It was about the fear that success I hadn't earned would somehow invalidate the success I had earned, that inheriting wealth would make me into the kind of person I'd spent my entire adult life trying not to become. But then I remembered something Grandpa Bill had said, during one of our library conversations, about the difference between inheriting money and inheriting responsibility. Money was just a tool, he'd explained, and tools were only as valuable as the purposes they served. The real question wasn't whether I deserved to inherit Morgan Industries, but whether I could use that inheritance to accomplish things that mattered more than my own comfort or security. If I could transform the company into something that actually helped solve environmental problems while providing good jobs and honest profits, then the inheritance would be justified by its results rather than its origins. I called Elena Rodriguez that afternoon and told her I was ready to accept Grandpa Bill's conditions and begin the transition process. She sounded pleased but not surprised, as if she'd been confident all along that I would make that choice. "Alex," she said, "your grandfather would be proud of your decision, but more importantly, he would be excited to see what you accomplish with the opportunities he's given you. The paperwork will take several weeks to complete, but we can begin the practical transition immediately, if you're ready." The phone calls to Marcus and my mother that evening were easier than I'd expected, though both conversations carried undercurrents of loss and uncertainty that couldn't be completely resolved with reassurance. Marcus was already making plans to hire additional technical staff and expand EcoFlow's management structure to handle my absence, and his excitement about the challenges ahead reminded me why we'd become partners in the first place. My mother was quiet for a long time after I told her about my decision, but finally said that she thought Grandpa Bill had chosen well, and that my father would have been proud to see what his son had accomplished. Part 4. The first day I walked into Morgan Industries as the owner rather than the groundskeeper's grandson felt like stepping into someone else's life. The lobby was all polished marble and dark wood, with a reception desk that looked like it belonged in a five-star hotel, and oil paintings of Connecticut landscapes that probably cost more than I'd made in my first year out of college. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with carefully styled gray hair and a professional smile, looked genuinely confused when I introduced myself. "Mr. Morgan," she said. "I wasn't expecting you today. Should I let Mr. Robert know you're here?" The title felt strange in my mouth, but I was going to have to get used to it. "Actually," I said, "I was hoping to speak with him and get a tour of the facilities. I'm going to be taking over operations here, and I'd like to understand how everything currently works before we start making changes." Her confusion deepened, and I realized that news of the inheritance probably hadn't filtered down to the administrative staff yet. She made a quick phone call, speaking in hushed tones that suggested she was reporting unusual activity that might require management attention. Robert appeared in the lobby 5 minutes later, and I could see him struggling to maintain professional composure while processing the reality that I was now technically his employer. He wore a dark suit that fit perfectly and carried himself with the same authoritative posture I remembered from family gatherings, but there was something different in his eyes, a wariness that suggested he understood the fundamental shift in our relationship. "Alex," he said, extending his hand for a formal handshake, "I understand congratulations are in order. We should probably discuss how you want to handle the transition." The tour of Morgan Industries took most of the morning, and I found myself impressed despite my preconceptions about traditional real estate development. The company employed 43 people across 3 departments: project development, construction management, and client services. They specialized in mixed-use commercial developments, municipal buildings, and residential communities designed for upper-middle-class families. The work was competent and profitable, but I could see immediately why Grandpa Bill had been concerned about the company's long-term prospects. Nothing they were building incorporated advanced energy efficiency technology, sustainable materials, or innovative design concepts that would distinguish Morgan Industries from dozens of similar companies. Robert's office was larger than my entire apartment in Portland, with windows overlooking the Connecticut River and furniture that belonged in an interior design magazine. We sat in leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, and he poured coffee from a machine that looked like it required an engineering degree to operate. "Alex," he said, settling back in his chair with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to important conversations, "I think we need to establish some ground rules for how this transition is going to work. You're obviously the owner now, but you don't have experience in real estate development, and making sudden changes could damage client relationships we've built over decades." His tone was respectful but condescending, the voice of an adult explaining complicated concepts to a child who needed careful guidance. I listened patiently as he outlined his concerns about my lack of industry experience, my unfamiliarity with Connecticut's regulatory environment, and the potential risks of implementing changes too quickly. Everything he said was probably true, but I could hear the underlying assumption that I would be smart enough to recognize my limitations and delegate real decision-making authority to people who understood the business better than I did. When he finished speaking, I leaned forward and pulled out a folder I'd prepared during my research over the past week. "Robert," I said, "I appreciate your concerns, and I agree that I have a lot to learn about traditional real estate development. But I also think Morgan Industries has a lot to learn about sustainable building practices and energy efficiency technology. I've prepared some preliminary research on market opportunities we're currently missing and competitors who are gaining market share by offering more innovative solutions to municipal and commercial clients. The folder contained analysis I'd compiled using techniques I'd learned during my EcoFlow systems research, examining Connecticut's renewable energy incentive programs, municipal sustainability requirements, and commercial building efficiency standards that were scheduled to become more stringent over the next 5 years. I'd also researched competitors who were successfully integrating environmental technology into traditional development projects, and I'd identified several potential client segments that Morgan Industries had never pursued because they required technical capabilities the company didn't currently possess. Part 6. The quarterly board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October, exactly 6 weeks after I'd officially taken control of Morgan Industries. I arrived at the conference room 30 minutes early, partly to review my presentation materials one final time, but mostly to sit alone in the space where I would either establish my credibility as a leader or confirm everyone's suspicions that I was an inexperienced outsider who'd inherited responsibilities beyond my capabilities. The conference table was mahogany, naturally surrounded by leather chairs that had probably witnessed decades of important business decisions. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Hartford's downtown skyline, and oil paintings of previous Morgan family patriarchs watched from gilded frames with expressions that seemed both judgmental and expectant. The board members began arriving at 9:45, each carrying the kind of leather portfolio that suggested serious preparation and decades of corporate experience. There was Margaret Chen, the retired president of Hartford National Bank, who'd served on Morgan Industries' board for 12 years. Thomas Washington, a commercial real estate attorney who specialized in municipal development contracts. Dr. Sandra Phillips, a professor of urban planning at Yale who provided academic perspective on sustainable development trends. And Robert, of course, who still served as president despite my ownership, though his role had been redefined in ways that hadn't been fully tested yet. Margaret Chen had requested this meeting specifically to review my plans for Morgan Industries' future direction, and I knew that her assessment would carry significant weight with the other board members. She was in her 70s, with silver hair pulled into an elegant bun, and intelligent eyes that missed nothing important. Her reputation in Connecticut's business community was impeccable, and her continued presence on the board provided credibility that a 26-year-old with no real estate experience desperately needed. She also happened to be genuinely curious about sustainable building practices, having served on several environmental nonprofit boards after her retirement from banking. I began my presentation by acknowledging what everyone in the room already knew, that I was young, inexperienced in real estate development, and facing skepticism from both industry peers and family members about my fitness to lead Morgan Industries. But instead of trying to downplay those limitations, I explained how they might actually represent advantages in a rapidly changing market where traditional approaches were becoming less effective and innovative solutions were creating new opportunities for companies willing to adapt their business models. The presentation focused on 3 major initiatives I wanted to implement over the next 18 months. First, Morgan Industries would become Connecticut's first real estate development company to achieve carbon-neutral operations by incorporating renewable energy systems, sustainable materials, and advanced efficiency technology into every project. This wasn't just about environmental responsibility, I explained, but about positioning the company to meet increasingly stringent municipal and state requirements for sustainable development while reducing long-term operating costs for clients. Second, we would establish a technology partnership program with companies like EcoFlow Systems and similar firms developing innovative building management solutions. Rather than trying to develop technical expertise internally, Morgan Industries would become a platform for implementing cutting-edge environmental technology in real-world construction projects. This would allow us to offer clients access to the latest energy efficiency innovations while building relationships with the tech companies that were reshaping the construction industry. Third, we would create an affordable housing division focused on energy-efficient homes for working-class families, funded through a combination of state renewable energy incentives, federal low-income housing tax credits, and private investment from impact-focused venture capital firms. This initiative would address Connecticut's affordable housing shortage while demonstrating that sustainable building practices could be economically viable across different market segments, not just luxury developments. Thomas Washington was the first to respond, and his questions were pointed but fair. Alex, he said, these initiatives sound admirable from a social responsibility perspective, but I'm concerned about the financial implications. Sustainable building materials and advanced technology systems typically increase construction costs by 15 to 20%, and our clients are already price sensitive in the current market. How do you plan to maintain profitability while implementing these changes? I'd anticipated this concern and had prepared detailed financial projections that demonstrated how higher upfront costs could be offset by lower operating expenses, premium pricing for sustainable features, and access to government incentive programs that weren't available to traditional development projects. More importantly, I'd researched competitors in other states who were successfully implementing similar strategies and achieving both profitability and rapid growth by positioning themselves as leaders in sustainable development. Dr. Phillips leaned forward with obvious interest when I mentioned the Affordable Housing Initiative. Alex, she said, this kind of cross-sector collaboration between private developers and impact investors is exactly what urban planning scholars have been advocating for years, but very few companies have been willing to take on the coordination challenges it requires. Have you identified specific partners for the technology integration and impact investment components? That question allowed me to share the most exciting development from my first 6 weeks as owner. Marcus and I had been working together to identify other companies developing complementary technologies, and we'd discovered a network of entrepreneurs and investors who were specifically interested in supporting sustainable development projects that could demonstrate scalability and replicability. 3 venture capital firms had already expressed preliminary interest in funding Morgan Industries' Affordable Housing Initiative as a pilot program that could be expanded to other markets if the Connecticut implementation proved successful. Margaret Chen had been taking notes throughout my presentation, and when she finally spoke, her tone was measured but encouraging. Alex, she said, your vision for Morgan Industries is ambitious and potentially transformative, but implementing these changes will require careful management of both financial resources and organizational culture. Our current employees have decades of experience in traditional development practices, and asking them to adopt entirely new approaches while maintaining project quality and deadline commitments will be challenging. How do you plan to handle the human resources aspects of this transition? The question touched on something I'd been thinking about constantly since taking over the company. Robert had introduced me to each department head during my first week, and I'd spent time observing their work processes, client interactions, and team dynamics. The employees were competent and dedicated, but most of them had been working the same way for years and might resist changes that required learning new skills or adjusting established routines. Some of them were also clearly uncertain about working for someone young enough to be their son and lacking traditional qualifications for real estate leadership. I explained my plan to implement changes gradually, beginning with pilot projects that would allow employees to gain experience with sustainable building practices and new technology systems, while continuing to work on traditional projects that generated steady revenue. We would also invest in professional development and training programs, bringing in experts to teach sustainable design principles, energy efficiency technology, and project management techniques that integrated environmental considerations into every phase of development planning. The board meeting continued for 3 hours, with detailed discussions about budget allocations, timeline expectations, risk management strategies, and performance metrics for evaluating the success of my proposed initiatives. By the end of the session, I felt cautiously optimistic that I'd addressed their major concerns and demonstrated enough preparation and strategic thinking to earn their provisional support. Margaret Chen summarized the consensus when she said that the board would approve my proposed budget and timeline while requiring quarterly progress reports and the flexibility to adjust strategies based on early implementation results. Robert had been unusually quiet during most of the meeting, contributing operational insights when asked but avoiding the kind of leadership role he'd probably played in previous board sessions. When the other members left, he remained in the conference room, organizing his papers with the kind of deliberate attention that suggested he had something important to say, but wasn't sure how to begin. Finally, he looked up and spoke directly to me for the first time since the meeting had started. "Alex," he said, "I want you to know that I think your presentation was well prepared, and your ideas have merit, even though they represent a significant departure from how we've operated for the past 20 years. I also want you to know that I've decided to support your leadership publicly, both within the company and in our industry networks, because I believe Dad made the right choice, even though it wasn't the choice I expected." His words carried weight I hadn't anticipated, and I realized that earning Robert's endorsement would be crucial for establishing credibility with employees, clients, and competitors who might otherwise dismiss me as an inexperienced outsider. But Robert wasn't finished with his assessment. He leaned back in his chair and studied me with the kind of careful attention I remembered from childhood encounters, when he was trying to determine whether I was trustworthy enough to be left alone in important family spaces. However, he continued, implementing these changes successfully will require more than good intentions and innovative ideas. You'll need to prove that sustainable development practices can generate consistent profits in Connecticut's market conditions, that our existing clients will accept premium pricing for environmental features, and that our employees can master new technologies without compromising project quality or delivery schedules. The challenge he was describing was exactly what I'd been losing sleep over since accepting the inheritance. Leading Morgan Industries wasn't just about implementing my vision for sustainable development, it was about managing dozens of variables I couldn't completely control, from employee adaptation to client acceptance to regulatory changes that might affect project feasibility. But Robert's willingness to support my leadership publicly gave me confidence that the transition might be more manageable than I'd feared, especially if I could demonstrate early success with pilot projects that proved the viability of my strategic approach. The conversation with Robert continued through lunch at a downtown restaurant where he was clearly a regular customer. The waitstaff knew his preferences, and other business leaders stopped by our table to pay their respects and exchange brief updates about mutual clients and industry developments. Robert introduced me as the new owner of Morgan Industries without any apparent reluctance, and I could see him observing how I handled these impromptu networking opportunities. By the end of the meal, I felt like I'd passed some kind of informal examination that I hadn't realized I was taking. That afternoon, I called Marcus to update him on the board meeting and discuss coordination between EcoFlow Systems and Morgan Industries for our first collaborative project. We'd identified a municipal building renovation in Hartford that required both energy efficiency upgrades and sustainable design improvements, exactly the kind of assignment that would allow us to demonstrate how technology partnerships could enhance traditional development capabilities. Marcus was excited about the opportunity to work on a larger scale than EcoFlow typically handled, and his enthusiasm reminded me why our partnership had been so successful in Portland. The project would serve as a pilot program for the sustainable development initiatives I'd outlined to the board, but it would also test my ability to coordinate complex relationships between Morgan Industries employees, EcoFlow Systems technical staff, municipal administrators, and regulatory officials who would oversee compliance with environmental standards. Success would require managing personalities, timelines, budgets, and technical specifications simultaneously while maintaining quality standards that would establish our reputation in Connecticut's sustainable development market. The phone call from Victoria that evening surprised me, partly because we hadn't spoken since our breakfast conversation several weeks earlier, but mostly because her tone suggested excitement rather than the resignation I'd heard during our previous discussion. "Alex," she said, "I've been thinking about our conversation and about the changes you're planning for Morgan Industries. I know this might sound presumptuous, but I'd like to discuss the possibility of working with you on the affordable housing initiative you mentioned to the board." Victoria's request caught me completely off guard. She'd never shown interest in housing policy, environmental issues, or any kind of work that involved helping people with fewer advantages than herself. But as she explained her thinking, I began to understand that her financial difficulties with Jonathan's hedge fund had given her a new perspective on economic vulnerability and the importance of affordable housing options for working families. She'd also been researching Connecticut's housing shortage and had discovered that sustainable, energy-efficient homes could provide long-term cost savings that made homeownership more accessible for families with moderate incomes. We talked for over an hour about her ideas for integrating social impact considerations into real estate development, and I was impressed by the research she'd done and the connections she'd identified between environmental sustainability and economic opportunity. Victoria had always been intelligent, but she'd previously applied that intelligence to social climbing and luxury consumption rather than problem solving or community development. The prospect of working together on meaningful projects felt like an opportunity to rebuild our relationship while expanding Morgan Industries' capabilities in areas where I lacked experience and connections. By the time we ended the conversation, we'd agreed that Victoria would prepare a detailed proposal for her involvement in the Affordable Housing Initiative, including specific responsibilities, performance expectations, and compensation arrangements that would be fair to both of us, while maintaining clear boundaries about decision-making authority. The arrangement would also need to be structured carefully to avoid family favoritism accusations, while giving Victoria meaningful work that utilized her skills and addressed her financial needs. The weeks following the board meeting passed quickly, filled with the kind of detailed planning and relationship building that successful business transitions require. I spent time with each department head, learning about their specific responsibilities and discussing how sustainable development practices would affect their daily work. I met with existing clients to explain Morgan Industries' new direction and gauge their interest in environmental features for current and future projects. I researched potential new clients who might be specifically interested in sustainable development services, including municipalities, nonprofit organizations, and corporations with environmental responsibility commitments. The learning curve was steep, but I found myself energized by the complexity and variety of challenges that real estate development presented. Every project required coordination between architects, engineers, contractors, regulatory officials, and financial institutions, all of whom had different priorities and constraints that needed to be balanced against client requirements and budget limitations. Adding sustainable development considerations made everything more complicated, but it also created opportunities for innovation and differentiation that traditional approaches couldn't achieve. The municipal building renovation project became my primary focus during those weeks, both because it would serve as a proof of concept for our sustainable development capabilities and because its success or failure would significantly influence how the Hartford business community perceived Morgan Industries under my leadership. The building was a 1960s-era office complex that housed city administrative offices, and the renovation needed to address both functional improvements and energy efficiency upgrades while maintaining full operations throughout the construction process. Marcus arrived from Portland for the project kickoff meeting, bringing 2 EcoFlow systems engineers and enough technical equipment to transform the building's energy management completely. Seeing him in Connecticut felt surreal, like 2 different phases of my life converging in ways I hadn't expected when I'd left Portland 2 months earlier. But his presence also provided crucial credibility with the municipal administrators and Morgan Industries employees who were still evaluating my leadership and wondering whether my ambitious plans could be implemented successfully. Part 7. The first major crisis came on a Tuesday morning in November. 6 months into my tenure as owner of Morgan Industries, I arrived at the office to find Robert waiting in my office with an expression that immediately told me something serious had gone wrong. The Hartford Municipal Building Project, our flagship sustainable development initiative, had failed a critical inspection, and the city was threatening to terminate our contract unless we could resolve the compliance issues within 48 hours. The inspector had identified problems with the integration between our energy management systems and the building's existing electrical infrastructure, problems that could potentially affect safety and regulatory approval for the entire renovation. Robert handed me a folder containing the inspection report, and I could see him watching my reaction carefully as I read through the technical violations and compliance failures that threatened to derail not just this project, but our entire strategy for establishing Morgan Industries as a leader in sustainable development. The inspector's language was formal but damning, describing integration issues that suggested inadequate coordination between our construction team and EcoFlow Systems' technical installation process. More importantly, the report questioned whether Morgan Industries possessed sufficient expertise in advanced building systems to handle projects that required sophisticated technology integration. Marcus was on a plane from Portland within 3 hours of my emergency phone call, but even his immediate response couldn't eliminate the possibility that we might lose the contract and suffer reputational damage that would make future sustainable development projects much more difficult to secure. The municipal administrators who had initially been enthusiastic about our innovative approach were now expressing doubts about our capabilities, and I could sense that other clients were beginning to reconsider their own projects with Morgan Industries. The technical problems were complex but solvable, requiring modifications to both the electrical infrastructure and the energy management software that would take approximately 36 hours to implement and test. But the real challenge was managing the political and business relationships that had been damaged by our initial failure to meet inspection standards. The city administrators needed reassurance that Morgan Industries could deliver on our promises, and our employees needed confidence that my leadership could handle major setbacks without compromising the company's stability and reputation. I spent that Tuesday afternoon in emergency meetings with our construction supervisor, the municipal facilities manager, and the electrical contractor who was responsible for infrastructure modifications. Each conversation revealed additional complications and coordination challenges that hadn't been apparent during our initial project planning, and I began to understand why Robert had been concerned about implementing new technologies too quickly without adequate testing and preparation time. The construction supervisor, a man named Mike Sullivan who'd been with Morgan Industries for 18 years, was diplomatically but clearly frustrated with the additional complexity that sustainable development projects introduced into his established work processes. Mike was competent and experienced, but he was also accustomed to traditional construction methods that relied on proven technologies and standardized procedures. Integrating advanced energy management systems required him to coordinate with technology specialists who spoke a different professional language and operated according to different timeline and quality expectations. The municipal facilities manager, Janet Rodriguez, had been one of our strongest supporters during the initial project approval process, but her enthusiasm was noticeably diminished as she explained how the inspection failure had created problems with her own supervisors and budget administrators. Municipal contracts required adherence to strict compliance standards, and any contractor who failed inspections faced scrutiny that could affect future bidding opportunities. Janet made it clear that Morgan Industries would need to demonstrate not just technical competence but also project management reliability that minimized risks for municipal administrators who had advocated for our selection. Marcus arrived Wednesday morning looking like he'd spent the flight reviewing technical documentation and preparing solutions for problems he'd only heard about over the phone. He immediately dove into diagnostic work with David Kim, our electrical engineer, and by noon they'd identified the specific integration issues that had caused the inspection failure. The problems were fixable, but they also revealed gaps in our coordination processes that would need to be addressed systematically to prevent similar failures in future projects. The solution required replacing 3 control modules, reconfiguring the energy management software, and implementing additional testing protocols that should have been completed before the initial inspection. Marcus and David worked through Wednesday night, with Mike Sullivan providing construction support and Janet Rodriguez monitoring progress on behalf of the municipal administration. I spent most of those hours managing communications with our other clients, board members, and employees who were watching to see how we would handle our first major crisis under my leadership. Thursday morning's re-inspection was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and I arrived at the municipal building at 8:30 to review the completed modifications and coordinate final preparations with our team. Marcus looked exhausted but confident as he walked me through the integrated systems that now functioned exactly as we'd originally promised. The energy management controls responded properly to building occupancy and weather conditions, the electrical infrastructure handled load changes smoothly, and all safety systems operated within required parameters. The inspection took 3 hours, with the municipal inspector examining every component and integration point that had failed during the previous evaluation. Janet Rodriguez accompanied the inspector, asking detailed questions about system operation and maintenance requirements that demonstrated her commitment to ensuring long-term success rather than just immediate compliance. By 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon, we had passed all inspection requirements and received official approval to complete the remaining phases of the renovation project. The crisis had cost us approximately $15,000 in emergency modifications and overtime expenses, but it had also taught us crucial lessons about project management and quality control that would prevent similar problems in future sustainable development projects. More importantly, our successful response to the inspection failure had actually strengthened relationships with municipal administrators and construction team members who now understood that Morgan Industries could handle significant challenges without compromising project quality or client service. Robert's assessment of the crisis response surprised me with its generosity and insight. "Alex," he said during our debriefing meeting Friday morning, "every construction company faces major problems on complex projects, and the measure of leadership isn't avoiding those problems but solving them quickly and learning from them systematically. Your handling of this situation demonstrated exactly the FUMP the re. Let's also need to be structured carefully to avoid family favoritism accusations while giving Victoria meaningful work that utilized her skills and addressed her financial needs." The weeks following the board meeting passed quickly, filled with the kind of detailed planning and relationship building that successful business transitions require. I spent time with each department head, learning about their specific responsibilities and discussing how sustainable development practices would affect their daily work. I met with existing clients to explain Morgan Industries' new direction and gauge their interest in environmental features for current and future projects. I researched potential new clients who might be specifically interested in sustainable development services, including municipalities, nonprofit organizations, and corporations with environmental responsibility commitments. The learning curve was steep, but I found myself energized by the complexity and variety of challenges that real estate development presented. Every project required coordination between architects, engineers, contractors, regulatory officials, and financial institutions, all of whom had different priorities and constraints that needed to be balanced against client requirements and budget limitations. Adding sustainable development considerations made everything more complicated, but it also created opportunities for innovation and differentiation that traditional approaches couldn't achieve. The municipal building renovation project became my primary focus during those weeks, both because it would serve as a proof of concept for our sustainable development capabilities and because its success or failure would significantly influence how the Hartford business community perceived Morgan Industries under my leadership. The building was a 1960s-era office complex that housed city administrative offices, and the renovation needed to address both functional improvements and energy efficiency upgrades while maintaining full operations throughout the construction process. Marcus arrived from Portland for the project kickoff meeting, bringing 2 EcoFlow systems engineers and enough technical equipment to transform the building's energy management completely. Seeing him in Connecticut felt surreal, like 2 different phases of my life converging in ways I hadn't expected when I'd left Portland 2 months earlier. But his presence also provided crucial credibility with the municipal administrators and Morgan Industries employees who were still evaluating my leadership and wondering whether my ambitious plans could be implemented successfully. Part 7. The first major crisis came on a Tuesday morning in November, 6 months into my tenure as owner of Morgan Industries. I arrived at the office to find Robert waiting in my office with an expression that immediately told me something serious had gone wrong. The Hartford Municipal Building Project, our flagship sustainable development initiative, had failed a critical inspection, and the city was threatening to terminate our contract unless we could resolve the compliance issues within 48 hours. The inspector had identified problems with the integration between our energy management systems and the building's existing electrical infrastructure, problems that could potentially affect safety and regulatory approval for the entire renovation. Robert handed me a folder containing the inspection report, and I could see him watching my reaction carefully as I read through the technical violations and compliance failures that threatened to derail not just this project, but our entire strategy for establishing Morgan Industries as a leader in sustainable development. The inspector's language was formal but damning, describing integration issues that suggested inadequate coordination between our construction team and EcoFlow Systems' technical installation process. More importantly, the report questioned whether Morgan Industries possessed sufficient expertise in advanced building systems to handle projects that required sophisticated technology integration. Marcus was on a plane from Portland within 3 hours of my emergency phone call, but even his immediate response couldn't eliminate the possibility that we might lose the contract and suffer reputational damage that would make future sustainable development projects much more difficult to secure. The municipal administrators who had initially been enthusiastic about our innovative approach were now expressing doubts about our capabilities, and I could sense that other clients were beginning to reconsider their own projects with Morgan Industries. The technical problems were complex but solvable, requiring modifications to both the electrical infrastructure and the energy management software that would take approximately 36 hours to implement and test. But the real challenge was managing the political and business relationships that had been damaged by our initial failure to meet inspection standards. The city administrators needed reassurance that Morgan Industries could deliver on our promises, and our employees needed confidence that my leadership could handle major setbacks without compromising the company's stability and reputation. I spent that Tuesday afternoon in emergency meetings with our construction supervisor, the municipal facilities manager, and the electrical contractor who was responsible for infrastructure modifications. Each conversation revealed additional complications and coordination challenges that hadn't been apparent during our initial project planning, and I began to understand why Robert had been concerned about implementing new technologies too quickly without adequate testing and preparation time. The construction supervisor, a man named Mike Sullivan who'd been with Morgan Industries for 18 years, was diplomatically but clearly frustrated with the additional complexity that sustainable development projects introduced into his established work processes. Mike was competent and experienced, but he was also accustomed to traditional construction methods that relied on proven technologies and standardized procedures. Integrating advanced energy management systems required him to coordinate with technology specialists who spoke a different professional language and operated according to different timeline and quality expectations. The municipal facilities manager, Janet Rodriguez, had been one of our strongest supporters during the initial project approval process, but her enthusiasm was noticeably diminished as she explained how the inspection failure had created problems with her own supervisors and budget administrators. Municipal contracts required adherence to strict compliance standards, and any contractor who failed inspections faced scrutiny that could affect future bidding opportunities. Janet made it clear that Morgan Industries would need to demonstrate not just technical competence but also project management reliability that minimized risks for municipal administrators who had advocated for our selection. Marcus arrived Wednesday morning looking like he'd spent the flight reviewing technical documentation and preparing solutions for problems he'd only heard about over the phone. He immediately dove into diagnostic work with David Kim, our electrical engineer, and by noon they'd identified the specific integration issues that had caused the inspection failure. The problems were fixable, but they also revealed gaps in our coordination processes that would need to be addressed systematically to prevent similar failures in future projects. The solution required replacing 3 control modules, reconfiguring the energy management software, and implementing additional testing protocols that should have been completed before the initial inspection. Marcus and David worked through Wednesday night, with Mike Sullivan providing construction support and Janet Rodriguez monitoring progress on behalf of the municipal administration. I spent most of those hours managing communications with our other clients, board members, and employees who were watching to see how we would handle our first major crisis under my leadership. Thursday morning's re-inspection was scheduled for 10 o'clock, and I arrived at the municipal building at 8:30 to review the completed modifications and coordinate final preparations with our team. Marcus looked exhausted but confident as he walked me through the integrated systems that now functioned exactly as we'd originally promised. The energy management controls responded properly to building occupancy and weather conditions, the electrical infrastructure handled load changes smoothly, and all safety systems operated within required parameters. The inspection took 3 hours, with the municipal inspector examining every component and integration point that had failed during the previous evaluation. Janet Rodriguez accompanied the inspector, asking detailed questions about system operation and maintenance requirements that demonstrated her commitment to ensuring long-term success rather than just immediate compliance. By 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon, we had passed all inspection requirements and received official approval to complete the remaining phases of the renovation project. The crisis had cost us approximately $15,000 in emergency modifications and overtime expenses, but it had also taught us crucial lessons about project management and quality control that would prevent similar problems in future sustainable development projects. More importantly, our successful response to the inspection failure had actually strengthened relationships with municipal administrators and construction team members who now understood that Morgan Industries could handle significant challenges without compromising project quality or client service. Robert's assessment of the crisis response surprised me with its generosity and insight. "Alex," he said during our debriefing meeting Friday morning, "every construction company faces major problems on complex projects, and the measure of leadership isn't avoiding those problems but solving them quickly and learning from them systematically. Your handling of this situation demonstrated exactly the kind of problem-solving ability and collaborative approach that sustainable development projects will require, and I think our team now has more confidence in your leadership than they did before the crisis occurred." The successful resolution of the municipal building crisis marked a turning point in my relationship with Morgan Industries employees and Connecticut business community members who had been skeptical about my qualifications and strategic direction. Within 2 weeks of completing the inspection requirements, we received inquiries about 3 additional municipal projects and 2 commercial developments that specifically requested sustainable building features and energy efficiency technology. Word was spreading that Morgan Industries could actually deliver on the innovative promises I'd been making since taking ownership of the company. Victoria's involvement in the Affordable Housing Initiative also began during this period, and her contributions exceeded my expectations in both quality and commitment. She'd prepared a comprehensive proposal that demonstrated thorough understanding of Connecticut's housing policy environment, federal and state incentive programs, and potential funding sources that could make energy-efficient, affordable housing economically viable for both developers and residents. Her connections in Hartford's political and business communities provided access to decision-makers and resources that would have taken me months to identify and cultivate. Working with Victoria required careful navigation of family dynamics and professional boundaries, but her intelligence and newly discovered work ethic made the collaboration productive and surprisingly comfortable. She approached affordable housing development with the same attention to detail and strategic thinking that she'd previously applied to social climbing and luxury consumption, and her ability to communicate effectively with both municipal administrators and potential residents proved invaluable for project planning and community outreach. The first affordable housing project was a modest development of 12 single-family homes designed for working families with household incomes between $40,000 and $60,000 annually. Each home would incorporate advanced energy efficiency features that would reduce utility costs by approximately 30% compared to conventional construction, making home ownership more affordable while demonstrating sustainable building practices that could be replicated in other markets. The project would also serve as a showcase for the technology partnerships and innovative financing arrangements that distinguished Morgan Industries from traditional affordable housing developers. Financing for the project came from multiple sources, including federal low-income housing tax credits, Connecticut's renewable energy incentive programs, and private investment from impact-focused venture capital firms that Marcus and I had identified during our networking efforts in the sustainable development community. The complexity of coordinating these different funding streams required expertise that neither I nor Victoria possessed initially, but Elena Rodriguez connected us with specialists in affordable housing finance who provided consulting services and helped us navigate regulatory requirements. The design phase involved collaboration between our architectural team, EcoFlow systems engineers, and community representatives who provided input about neighborhood needs and aesthetic preferences. We discovered that sustainable building features could actually enhance rather than compromise design quality when they were integrated thoughtfully into architectural planning from the beginning of the process. Solar panels became roof design elements, energy-efficient windows provided better natural lighting, and advanced insulation systems enabled more flexible interior layouts that maximized usable space. Construction began in February, 8 months after I'd accepted the inheritance and 6 months after we'd started serious planning for the Affordable Housing Initiative. The project timeline was ambitious but achievable, with completion scheduled for late spring to allow families to move in before the beginning of the new school year. Local media coverage was generally positive, focusing on the innovative technology features and community development benefits rather than skepticism about our capabilities or experience. The community response exceeded our expectations, with applications from qualified families outnumbering available homes by more than 3 to 1 within the first week of our announcement. Interest came not just from Hartford area residents but from working families in surrounding communities who had been priced out of home ownership by rising costs and limited inventory of affordable housing options. The demand validated our market research and suggested that sustainable, affordable housing could be scalable to other Connecticut communities if our pilot project proved successful. Managing construction while simultaneously handling our ongoing commercial projects required organizational capabilities that tested the limits of our current staffing and project management systems. I found myself working 12-hour days and delegating responsibilities to employees who were still adjusting to new leadership and expanded expectations. Robert's operational experience became invaluable during this period, as his knowledge of construction logistics and client management helped prevent minor problems from becoming major crises. The spring completion deadline created pressure that intensified as winter weather delayed some construction phases and revealed additional coordination challenges between our traditional building team and the technology specialists who were installing energy management systems. But the same crisis management skills we'd developed during the municipal building project allowed us to address problems quickly and maintain quality standards while meeting timeline commitments to families who were planning their moves around our completion schedule. The first home was completed in April, and the energy efficiency testing results exceeded our projections by nearly 10%. The building performed exactly as our computer models had predicted, with energy consumption significantly below conventional construction standards and utility costs that would save homeowners approximately $150 monthly compared to similar-sized traditional homes. The savings would accumulate to thousands of dollars annually, making a meaningful difference in household budgets for working families who often struggled with rising energy costs. Part 8, the grand opening of the Millbrook Sustainable Community took place on a Saturday morning in May, exactly 1 year after I'd accepted Grandpa Bill's inheritance and committed to transforming Morgan Industries into something he would have been proud to see. 12 families had gathered for the ceremonial key presentation, their children running across lawns that were still being seeded while parents explored homes that represented months of planning, innovation, and collaborative problem-solving. The morning sun reflected off solar panels that were already generating electricity for energy-efficient appliances and heating systems that would keep utility bills affordable for years to come. Local television stations covered the event, interviewing families about their experiences with the application process and their excitement about moving into homes that combined affordability with environmental responsibility. One mother, Maria Santos, explained how the reduced utility costs would allow her family to save money for her daughter's college education while living in a community that demonstrated sustainable living practices. Her husband, Carlos, spoke about the quality of construction and the pride he felt in owning a home that represented innovation rather than compromise. Victoria handled media coordination with professional skill that reminded me she'd always been good at managing public perception and social dynamics. She'd prepared information packets for reporters, arranged interviews with satisfied residents, and coordinated facility tours that highlighted the sustainable features without overwhelming visitors with technical details. Her ability to translate complex environmental technology into accessible language proved crucial for generating positive coverage that would influence public opinion about sustainable, affordable housing and Morgan Industries' capabilities. The coverage was overwhelmingly positive, focusing on the innovative financing arrangements, the environmental benefits, and the community development impact rather than skepticism about our inexperience or concerns about technology integration. Several articles mention Morgan Industries' transformation under new leadership, describing how a traditional real estate development company had successfully expanded into sustainable building practices while maintaining profitability and community support. The recognition felt validating, but more importantly, it generated inquiries from other municipalities and developers who were interested in replicating our approach in their own communities. Robert's speech during the opening ceremony surprised me with its genuine enthusiasm for what we'd accomplished and its explicit support for continued expansion of our sustainable development initiatives. He spoke about Morgan Industries' evolution from traditional real estate development to innovative community building, acknowledging both the challenges and the opportunities that change had created for our employees, clients, and business partners. His endorsement carried weight with local business leaders and municipal administrators who respected his industry experience and conservative approach to business management. The financial results from our first year of sustainable development operations exceeded our projections in almost every category. The municipal building renovation had come in slightly over budget due to the inspection crisis, but the additional costs had been offset by premium pricing for subsequent projects and reduced marketing expenses as word-of-mouth referrals generated new business opportunities. The affordable housing project had achieved target profit margins while demonstrating market demand that justified expansion to additional communities. Most importantly, our traditional commercial projects had maintained consistent profitability while incorporating sustainable features that differentiated Morgan Industries from competitors. Marcus had decided to relocate EcoFlow Systems headquarters from Portland to Hartford, establishing a permanent partnership between our companies that would allow for more integrated project planning and more efficient technology implementation. His decision reflected both the business opportunities that our collaboration had created and his personal commitment to sustainable development work that made meaningful differences in communities. The partnership had evolved beyond consulting arrangements into shared strategic planning and joint venture development that leveraged both companies' expertise more effectively. The board meeting that month was the most positive since I'd taken ownership of the company, with Margaret Chen commenting that Morgan Industries had achieved exactly the kind of strategic transformation that most family businesses struggled to implement successfully. Our financial performance, market positioning, and employee satisfaction metrics all indicated sustainable growth that could be maintained and expanded over multiple years. Dr. Phillips noted that our projects were beginning to influence industry standards and municipal policy discussions about sustainable development requirements and incentive programs. But success brought new challenges and responsibilities that I hadn't anticipated when I'd first accepted Grandpa Bill's inheritance. Other real estate developers were beginning to copy our sustainable building approaches, creating competition that would require continued innovation and market differentiation. Municipal administrators were requesting more ambitious projects with shorter timelines and more complex technology integration requirements. Environmental organizations were pressuring us to set more aggressive sustainability targets and take public positions on policy issues that could affect our relationships with traditional business partners. The expansion opportunities were exciting but demanding, requiring investment in additional staff, enhanced technology capabilities, and expanded facilities that would strain our current resources while positioning us for long-term growth. I found myself making decisions about equipment purchases, personnel hiring, and strategic partnerships that would influence Morgan Industries' development for years beyond my initial commitment to maintain ownership for 5 years as specified in Grandpa Bill's will. Victoria's role had evolved into a full-time position coordinating affordable housing development, community outreach, and municipal relationship management. Her work had proven so valuable that I'd offered her a permanent executive position with equity participation that would give her long-term financial security while aligning her interests with the company's continued success. The arrangement had resolved her immediate financial problems while providing Morgan Industries with capabilities that would have been difficult and expensive to develop internally. The personal transformation that had accompanied my professional responsibilities was less visible but equally significant. I'd grown more confident in leadership situations, more comfortable with complex decision-making, and more skillful at managing relationships with people who had different priorities and communication styles. The imposter syndrome that had initially plagued my interactions with industry peers and municipal administrators had largely disappeared, replaced by genuine competence and earned credibility that allowed me to focus on strategic planning rather than constantly proving my qualifications. The relationship with my mother had also evolved as she'd transitioned from groundskeeper cottage resident to family member of a successful business owner. She'd decided to enroll in community college courses in landscape architecture, pursuing educational opportunities that had been financially impossible during her years as estate staff. Her dream of designing public gardens and urban green spaces could finally be realized, supported by both financial resources and professional connections that Morgan Industries' success had made available. Marcus and I often worked late into the evening reviewing project proposals and discussing expansion strategies in the conference room where I'd first presented my vision to the board. Our collaboration had deepened beyond business partnership into genuine friendship based on shared values and complementary skills that made both companies more effective than either could have been independently. His technical expertise combined with my business development capabilities had created opportunities that neither EcoFlow Systems nor Morgan Industries could have pursued alone. The phone call from Elena Rodriguez came on a Wednesday evening in June, 13 months after the will reading that had changed everything about my life and career prospects. "Alex," she said, "I have some news that might interest you. Robert and Patricia have decided to drop their legal challenge to your grandfather's will. They've concluded that the costs and risks of continued litigation outweigh any potential benefits, especially given the obvious success you've achieved with Morgan Industries. Their attorney has filed the appropriate paperwork to withdraw all claims and objections." The legal challenge had been a background concern throughout the first year, creating uncertainty about long-term ownership and influencing some of my strategic decisions about capital investment and business expansion. While I'd been confident that the will would withstand legal scrutiny, the litigation process could have consumed time and resources that were better devoted to building the company and implementing sustainable development initiatives. Robert and Patricia's decision to withdraw their challenge eliminated that distraction and confirmed my ownership rights beyond any reasonable doubt. Elena's assessment of the situation was characteristically direct and practical. "Alex," she said, "I think Robert and Patricia recognized that challenging a will on mental competency grounds would have required them to demonstrate that William Morgan was incapable of making sound business decisions at exactly the time when his chosen heir was proving those decisions to be remarkably astute. Your success with Morgan Industries has validated your grandfather's judgment in ways that would have made their legal position very difficult to defend. The resolution of the legal uncertainty allowed me to make long-term commitments and investments that would position Morgan Industries for continued growth and market leadership in sustainable development. We could now purchase equipment, sign multi-year contracts, and hire additional staff without concerns about ownership disputes that might affect business operations. More importantly, the family conflict that had shadowed the inheritance could finally be resolved in favor of collaboration rather than continued antagonism. Part 9. The second annual board meeting under my leadership took place in Morgan Industries' expanded conference room, now large enough to accommodate the additional board members we'd recruited to provide expertise in sustainable development, affordable housing policy, and clean technology financing. The presentation materials I'd prepared were substantially more sophisticated than the optimistic projections I'd shared during my first board meeting, backed by 15 months of operational results and market validation that demonstrated sustainable profitability and continued growth potential. Margaret Chen began the meeting by acknowledging what everyone in the room already understood, that Morgan Industries had achieved a strategic transformation that exceeded initial expectations while maintaining financial performance that supported continued expansion and innovation. Our revenue had increased by 38% over the previous year. Profit margins had improved despite higher material costs for sustainable building components, and client satisfaction metrics indicated strong market positioning for future growth. More importantly, our success had influenced industry standards and municipal policy discussions in ways that created favorable conditions for continued expansion. The financial presentation revealed results that validated every element of the strategic plan I'd outlined during my initial board meeting. The municipal building renovation had generated follow-up contracts worth over $2 million, establishing Morgan Industries as Hartford's preferred contractor for sustainable government facility projects. The Affordable Housing Initiative had produced waiting lists that justified expansion to 3 additional communities with financing arrangements that would generate consistent revenue streams while maintaining affordable pricing for working families. Traditional commercial projects had incorporated sustainable features that commanded premium pricing while reducing long-term operating costs for clients. Thomas Washington raised questions about scalability and market saturation that reflected his legal training and conservative approach to business expansion. "Alex," he said, "your results have been impressive, but I'm concerned about whether Connecticut's market can support continued growth at the pace you're projecting. Sustainable development remains a niche market, and increased competition from other developers might limit future opportunities for premium pricing and rapid expansion." His concerns were valid and reflected industry realities that needed careful consideration in our strategic planning. My response drew on market research that Marcus and I had conducted throughout the past year, analyzing demographic trends, regulatory changes, and economic factors that were driving demand for sustainable building solutions across multiple market segments. Connecticut's aging infrastructure required renovation and replacement that could incorporate energy efficiency technology while meeting increasingly stringent environmental standards. Population growth in suburban communities was creating demand for affordable housing that offered long-term cost savings through reduced utility expenses. Corporate clients were seeking sustainable facility solutions that supported environmental responsibility commitments while reducing operational costs. Dr. Phillips contributed academic perspective that supported our expansion strategy while identifying potential challenges that required strategic attention. "Alex," she said, "your success with integrating environmental technology and affordable housing development represents exactly the kind of innovation that urban planning scholars have been advocating for decades. However, scaling these approaches to larger markets will require coordination with municipal planning departments, state environmental agencies, and federal housing programs that operate according to different timelines and regulatory frameworks than private development projects." The discussion that followed explored opportunities and challenges associated with expanding beyond Connecticut into regional markets where Morgan Industries could replicate our sustainable development approach while adapting to different regulatory environments and competitive conditions. Marcus had identified potential partnerships with technology companies and impact investors in Massachusetts, New York, and New Jersey who were interested in supporting sustainable development projects that could demonstrate scalability and replicability across multiple markets. Victoria presented the affordable housing expansion plan she'd developed in collaboration with municipal administrators and community development organizations throughout Connecticut. Her proposal involved establishing Morgan Industries as a statewide leader in sustainable affordable housing through strategic partnerships with local governments, nonprofit organizations, and federal housing agencies that could provide financing and regulatory support for projects that served working families while demonstrating environmental innovation. The plan projected development of over 200 affordable homes during the following 3 years, generating substantial revenue while creating meaningful community impact. The board approved both the regional expansion strategy and the affordable housing scaling plan while requiring quarterly progress reports and flexibility to adjust timelines based on market conditions and regulatory changes. Margaret Chen summarized the consensus when she observed that Morgan Industries had established a sustainable competitive advantage that justified continued investment in expansion while maintaining conservative financial management that protected against market volatility and regulatory uncertainty. Robert's participation in the board meeting demonstrated how completely our working relationship had evolved from the awkward dynamics that had characterized my first months as owner. He provided operational insights and industry perspective that enhanced strategic discussions while clearly supporting my leadership and decision-making authority. His institutional knowledge and client relationships had become valuable assets for expansion planning, and his credibility with traditional business leaders facilitated partnerships that might have been difficult for me to establish independently. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.